Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Again, be such an easy opportunity. To attain human birth in this planet at the time when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Sankirtan movement is going on. When again will such an opportunity be available? If we examine all the evidence in the scriptures, we won't find anything equal to the holy name. Because if we develop attachment to the holy name, then love of Krishna will automatically arise. And by love of Krishna, we get Krishna. Therefore, go on hearing and chanting incessantly, giving up all nonsense topics. The author of this song, Premananda, says, Kahi Premananda, having attained this human form of life, Manusha Janama, we should make it successful by chanting the holy names and not delay in doing so. I'm only talking about it. Krishna Devi is doing it.
No, still on the line.
Is this on? Yeah, okay.
It's the right on the middle one.
Sorry?
It's right on the block, the middle one.
Yeah, that's the right one. Okay, well, I wanted to speak about... Where did these come from? You gave them that lecture? Okay. Plus Rancho Darshan from Dhaka. You got that way?
BCD of the temple darshan.
Oh, I see. In Gujarati?
The version is not in Gujarati, but the darshan is in beautiful.
I see. But there's no narration, it's just... Okay. Alright, well, I wanted to speak about Srila Prabhupada coming to the West. I also wanted to sing the relevant songs, but seeing as we don't have them here. It's a great event.
Can they get sung?
Well, we have enough. It's in the songs of the Vaishnava Acharyas.
Which one is that?
They had song sheets this morning.
Oh, upstairs and didn't find it.
Anyway, if you can find it, it's good. If not, we'll go on without them. You can give this book, Jai Srila Prabhupada. This great event. Om Jnana-timirandhasya Jnananjana-shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Namah Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Namine Namaste Saraswate Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschakta Devi Shatari. So today is the Tithi on which Srila Prabhupada arrived in America. Tithi means the date calculated according to the lunar calendar. According to the Gregorian calendar, it's September the 18th, but according to the lunar calendar, this year it falls today. So, on Srila, I'd like to read something, which I wrote, about Srila Prabhupada's coming to the West. This great event. There are so many great journeys recorded in history. Marco Polo, his travels throughout the Orient, especially in China, Napoleon's heroically marching over the Alps in the winter. And then he got a journey off to some islands in the middle of the Atlantic. There are many. Columbus, his great journey to the west, further and further west. His sailors were going to mutiny. They were afraid they were going to fall off the edge of the world because they thought it was flat. If you go far enough, you'll go off the edge. So they were ready to mutiny. So there are many great journeys. The journey of the Plymouth Fathers, founding America. Well, here's the story of a journey ultimately much more important, although not recognized at the time, and still not recognized by the foolish people of this world, who glorify all kinds of idiots for doing all kinds of idiotic things, like kicking footballs around and acting even more stupidly than usual on a cinema set. This is discussing Srila Prabhupada's coming to the West. Devotees of Lord Krishna take pleasure in recounting his wonderful pastimes. Those pastimes purify the heart, attract the mind, and give solace to devotees suffering in separation from their beloved Lord. Because Krishna's pastimes are of the spiritual nature, they can be told again and again and constantly remembered without becoming stale. Indeed, the more they are relished, the more they become fresh. The pastimes of the Lord's pure devotees are of the same quality, and just as some devotees, according to their taste, take special pleasure in certain pastimes of the Lord, so the various pastimes of the pure devotees of the Lord, such as Srila Prabhupada, are variously relished by his followers. I, which means me, am simply fascinated by Prabhupada's having come to America. The bringing of Krishna consciousness to the West is probably the most amazing, unlikely. You have more? Okay, good. And glorious event in the history of the world. For so many long years, the West had developed a civilization based on ignorance, sin and suffering. Of course, in the West they think civilization is based on knowledge, the enlightenment, they call it. Then for the first time in its history, Srila Prabhupada brought real and complete knowledge to the West. So-called Vedantists and yogis had come before him with Indianized editions of the same illusion which was afflicting the West. They had simply brought sense gratification in another guise. But at last Srila Prabhupada brought the real thing, the nectar we were hankering for. Since the passing of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the idea of preaching in the West had all but been forgotten. However, Lord Chaitanya was constantly thinking about it, and all the previous acharyas were thinking about it. They anxiously thought, when will the day come when Mahaprabhu's prophecy will be fulfilled? How long will the world suffer without Lord Chaitanya's Prem Sankirtan? Then Prabhupada ventured forth, carrying the order of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the blessings of the acharyas as his baggage. Such boldness, such courage, such adventurous spirit, such lack of concern for personal well-being, such determination, such compassion, such fearlessness and such faith in the protection of Krishna. Prabhupada's having come alone and unaccompanied demonstrated his mood of self-reliance, his get-on-with-the-job spirit, and his being in a class distinct from others. Even if Srila Prabhupada had been unsuccessful, his coming shows that he was in a different mood than any of the thousands of other Vaishnavas in India. All of us were going to hell, but it didn't seem to matter to anyone else. Most Vaishnavas were content with eating, sleeping, performing their own sadhana, and perhaps giving a few speeches here and there. But Prabhupada's heart was tortured with compassion. He begged his godbrothers to help him, but despite their having institutions, prestige, followers and knowledge, none of them dared or cared to help. So Bhaktivedanta Swami waited no longer for any of them to make a move, but made his own instead. He was not the head of an institution. He had no support, manpower or money. No one cared whether he lived or died. But I have to try anyway. My spiritual master has ordered. Even Lord Chaitanya expressed his so-called inability to spread the Sankirtan movement alone. Even he, the Supreme Lord himself, had assistants, Sangopangastra Parshadam. But Prabhupada had none. Hence his going alone to the cold, unknown shores of the West is the most courageous act in the history of Vaishnavism. It demonstrates his complete fearlessness and faith in the protection of Krishna. When Srila Prabhupada got on that ship, no one took him seriously. They questioned, "What will you, an old man, do in America?" "I will make the Americans chant Hare Krishna and dance in ecstasy." "Impossible. Even the Indians are not interested. So how will the Americans be?" And Prabhupada later said that what he had accomplished far exceeded his expectations. But as he wrote on Boston Pier, "Shakare Shambhava Hoy Tumi She Kotuki." By your mercy, Krishna, everything is possible. No one cared for him, but Prabhupada cared for everyone. Otherwise, why would he attempt the impossible? He did not even care that no one cared for him. He knew that Krishna cared for him, and he wanted everyone to care for Krishna. While crossing the ocean, Srila Prabhupada read Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and preached to the crew. Then came 2 heart attacks, but Krishna came in a dream and said, "Don't worry, I'm rowing your boat." Prabhupada also wrote poems talking to Krishna. Then he landed and his American adventures began. Oh my dear spiritual master, I thank you so much for having taken the trouble to come to save us. How can we ever forget your kindness upon us? That tacky old ship at Boston Harbor Pier just happened to have an elderly Swami on board. A little unusual perhaps, but it's not news to anyone except Gopal and Sally Agarwal, who extend the politeness of hosting him for a few weeks. Stepping ashore, an old learned Bengali sadhu dressed in saffron-colored cloth humbly enters America, in like a needle. The world would never be the same again. Where were all of us then? You can think, where were you all on September the 18th or 13th, 1965? Where were you all? Some of you were in another body, right? Those who were born after that, in this body. I was an 8-year-old kid with no idea about anything. Prabhupada's followers were scattered all over the world with not even the slightest idea of the great fortune which would soon causelessly fill their empty lives. And many who have now dedicated their lives to that humble sadhu were not yet born. So it's 1966, going forward a little bit here. And this old Bengali sadhu, Abhay Charana Aravinda Bhakti Swami, walks among the, ready to translate this, Arjuna? Walks among the jaded, faded, hair down, mind gone, wild beat generation on the streets of New York's Lower East Side. When we translate that into English, it's pretty difficult. Prabhupada went among the fuzzheads, freaks and hippies, refugees from a godless, greed-torn civilization, and presented the absolute truth, the personality of Godhead. His contemporaries in Vrindavan and the staid, righteous sannyasis of the Gauriya Math would have been shocked. They would have had nothing to do with these dirty, irreverent lectures, that's for sure. But here he is, Bhaktivedanta Swami, down among the hippies, picking up gold from a filthy place, confident with his ching, 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 and Hare Krishna, giving the change all, be difference, a revolution that even they could never have imagined. None of his godbrothers could have tolerated the hardships which Srila Prabhupada underwent. He so tolerantly lived with and even served the Western Malechas, who out of ignorance constantly did things guaranteed to disturb any cultured Vaishnava. Devoid of refinement or any idea of Krishna consciousness, other than the rudiments which they were gradually learning by Srila Prabhupada so patiently teaching them, they nevertheless had faith in him. And Prabhupada had faith in the process of Krishna consciousness. Dino hino jato chilo, hariname udharelo. Even the most fallen will be saved by the holy name. Therefore he tolerated their uncouth behavior. He did not see American lectures. He saw jivas, servants of Krishna. He did not reject his followers for their weakness, or foolishness born of immaturity. Prabhupada demonstrated the efficacy of Bhakti Yoga in circumstances more adverse than any previous preachers of Bhakti had ever faced. He had patience, extreme tolerance born of deep compassion for the fallen souls, and faith in the power of the holy name. Srila Prabhupada found something vital and real amidst the madness of hippie life. Permeating the confusion was a spiritual surge, a dissatisfaction with the status quo, an endeavor for the mystical, for the truth beyond the humdrum. The hippies had been through it all: drugs, booze, free sex, music, and so-called meditation. But Krishna consciousness was something else, brought by a person who seemed as if from another planet, from an unimagined plane of existence that revealed their attempts at consciousness expansion to be puerile and insignificant. Like most other people, the hippies were not intrinsically bad, just misguided. They had seen through this nastiness of straight life and were looking for something better. Lacking proper guidance, they had turned down the blind alley of gross sense gratification. But for all the newness and euphoria of their crazy life, it was just as unfulfilling as the establishment they had already rejected. Swamiji, however, had something genuine, and he surely was not as straight. The hippies thrived on being different, but Prabhupada outdid them all. He had sharing, simplicity, color, joy, and love, all essential elements of the hippie counterculture, but he also brought substance, direction, knowledge, and purity. He had Krishna, and he had music. Prabhupada was all about music, kirtan. Music was the sacred beginning, middle, and end of hippie life. From the internationally famous bands to the street-side guitarists, music was an expression of being, of struggle, of lust, frustration, pain, hope, and longing. Music was both a message and a question, a quest for understanding and a plea to be understood. Swamiji's music was new. No one had ever played stuff like that. Every note, every word was magical, an intense mystical outpouring of the vital inner self. Man, is this hip. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Simple rhythm, simple tune, again and again, over and over, half an hour, 1 hour, more, Swami step, trance dance. This transcendental sound vibration is imported from the spiritual world. Far out. What does it do to you? Sometimes the devotees faint, sometimes they roll on the ground, and sometimes they shiver in ecstasy while chanting the holy names. Chanting and chanting, they give up their material bodies and go to the spiritual land of Vraja, where talking is singing, walking is dancing, and everyone's heart is stolen by a beautiful blackish cowherd boy, glancing mischievously at the gopis. He fills up the holes of his flute with nectarian sounds that stun all living beings within the three worlds. Through music and diligent concern, Srila Prabhupada did what everyone else had given up on. He reached the hearts of the hippies and gave them direction. Prabhupada was serious, and the more intelligent amongst the hippies gradually realized that he wanted them to follow him and also become serious about Krishna consciousness. Still, no one had any idea as to exactly how serious Prabhupada really was. No one understood why he incorporated the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. What was all that about when Krishna consciousness was just a rented storefront on the Lower East Side? Ramananda and company was shocked when Srila Prabhupada left for San Francisco, but Prabhupada had big plans. His magic worked again in San Francisco, and gradually it started working all over the world. Prabhupada spread his charm by sending his disciples here and there. They were young boys and girls, dropped out from everything, saved by Prabhupada from voluntary drug-induced brain destruction. They didn't know much about Krishna consciousness or about anything, but now they were different. No longer hippies, but happies. Srila Prabhupada had inspired a faith in them that made the Krishna magic work even without his personal presence. And by that faith, his disciples brought Guru and Krishna with them. Prabhupada was proud of his household disciples who succeeded in London, where his sannyasi godbrothers had failed. Indeed, these householders, fresh out of hippie life, with no background of Indian cultural life, and who are certainly not learned Vedic scholars, startled London with the Krishna chant. And so the story unfolded. Srila Prabhupada strode across the globe and like a great general sent men here and there to spread the Krishna message. It's a great story whose chapters are still being written. And in the future people will look back on these formative years of ISKCON and think, oh, how I wish I could have been there then. How exciting it must have been. All of Prabhupada's activities were amazing, yet those first days in America held a special sweetness and significance. None of us knows how intense was the struggle, nor how severe were the difficulties that Srila Prabhupada underwent for establishing the Krishna consciousness movement in the West. But Prabhupada knows, his Guru Maharaj knows, and Krishna knows. Let us all remember Srila Prabhupada's pastimes and thus become purified and happy. I especially pray that Prabhupada's Leela of coming to the West be ever manifest in my heart. Let me remember his sacrifice so that I may not become selfish. Let me remember his tolerance that I may become tolerant. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to Srila Prabhupada's coming to the West. All glories to your divine lotus feet, Srila Prabhupada. Please keep a place for me there always. Now here's a few quotes. One devotee, Prajapati, asked Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, why has it taken so long for a pure devotee to come to the West? Has the West been so sinful that no pure devotee has come before your divine grace? Srila Prabhupada laughs. Don't be sorry. At that time you were so sinful that you could not receive a pure devotee. Then one girl asked, Srila Prabhupada, would you please explain why Krishna consciousness hadn't come to the West until now? Why it hasn't come earlier? Srila Prabhupada, because you were not born. After your birth, we have come here to take you back home, back to Godhead. Now you take the opportunity. Come with us. We were waiting for your birth. To the question, why did Srila Prabhupada come to the West? Prabhupada, it is my duty. My spiritual master ordered me. So here's one song. Yeah, this is the song Prabhupada wrote at Boston Harbor on September the 18th, 1965. So this Prabhupada coming to the West, one of our devotees, his coming means not coming, and people go to Paris and they get their photos snapped in front of the Eiffel Tower. Then they go to New York and what do they have the picture snapped with the Twin Towers? Pretty difficult to get a photo of the Statue of Liberty. Did they get a photo taken now? It's kind of out in the sea and you have to be in a boat or something. Anyway, that's the idea. You go here and there and you tell people, I've been there, I went there, but Prabhupada didn't come as a tourist. His coming was practically as predicted in the Srimad Bhagavatam. There's the verse which Prabhupada quoted in his preface to the Srimad Bhagavatam. Tadvad visargo janataga viplavo yasmin prati shlokam apatavatyapi namanyanam tasya yashonkitani yachrinvanti gayanti gurnanti sadhava. Here, Narad Muni states to Vyasadeva, as he's ordering Vyasadeva, or suggesting to Vyasadeva to compile the Srimad Bhagavatam, that he, on the other hand, he says, he's just described in the verse before this, Vaya Samtirtha, literature which does not glorify Krishna is like a pilgrimage place for crows. And then he says, on the other hand, that literature which describes the unlimited Supreme Lord. Namanyananta, the names of the unlimited Supreme Lord, who is glorified by the topmost verses. That literature, even if imperfectly composed, is heard, chanted, and accepted by purified men who are thoroughly honest. And such literature, Janata Agha Viplavaha, will create a revolution in the impious lives of a misdirected population. So, who does this refer to? What is this verse about? The Srimad Bhagavatam will create a revolution in the misdirected lives of an impious population. Prabhupada came to America when he had published 3 volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam, the first canto of Bhagavatam, with the intention of of going on translating it. But when he had 3 volumes of Bhagavatam published, at that time he felt, now I'm ready to go to America. I have something to give the people, something substantial. That Srimad Bhagavatam, if we see the early editions, they were, of course, English is by itself, it's what's called a Lecha Bhasha, which means an irregular language, or a language spoken by meat eaters. But even grammatically it's irregular. There are so many irregularities. I mean, every language has some irregularities, but English, as Prabhupada offers, just like it's not phonetic, for instance. B, as Prabhupada would sometimes point out, B-U-T is pronounced but, and P-U-T is pronounced put. So you can never really tell how an English word is pronounced unless you hear how it's pronounced. And even educated people, they see a word in the dictionary and then they pronounce it all wrong. They pronounce it wrongly, to speak in more grammatically correct English. Because you just can't tell. But Prabhupada's English was certainly very cultured, but it belonged to that particular variety known as Indian English, in which Indians often, when speaking English, they tend to speak it as if they're translating from their own language, or they're not. Just like, for instance, in Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, Rajan, this word comes, and it's the vocative case where many times Shukadeva Goswami speaks to Parikshit Maharaj, Kalaya Doshanide Rajan. It's a vocative case. In English that's translated as O King, or just King, O King. So Prabhupada would translate this as O the King. So it's grammatically incorrect, and there are many such instances. But nevertheless, it had the powerful message of Godhead. So it was imperfectly composed, and it was distributed among the Janata Agha, sinful population. Now, up to this time, Bhagavatam had been spoken among pious people. Recitation of Bhagavatam went on in India among the pious people, which are many such pious people. But for the first time, Bhagavatam was being spoken among the impious people, and it actually created a spiritual revolution. So, what does this verse refer to if not Srila Prabhupada and his preaching? Bhagavat Tattva Vijnanam, scientific knowledge of the personality of Godhead, Bhagavat philosophy in the West. It must refer to Srila Prabhupada. So, Prabhupada, his coming, it appears to have been ordained even long in the past. so many acharyas came. They made their contributions. The Vaishnava Sampradaya, they made their various contributions in preaching, composing commentaries on Bhagavatam. The recent Acharya, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, was the inaugurator of the mission to present pure Krishna consciousness in the Western world. Nowadays, some scholars of Vaishnavism, motivated by envy, gleefully point out that before Prabhupada, a Vaishnava preacher went to the West. He was not the first. The first was Premananda Bharati. And apparently he had a few followers. This was maybe around the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century. Well, they don't point out that he's a complete Sahajya. He's not a bona fide Vaishnava in a bona fide Sampradaya. So they like to point this out. And Prabhupada was the first to bring pure devotion to the West. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was the Shuddha Bhaktiya Shrota Bhagirat. He was like the Bhagirat who brought the current of pure devotion. Bhagirat is described in the Puranas, Srimad Bhagavatam and other Puranas, and Mahabharata, and Ramayana, as the king who, with great diligence, after much endeavor by his predecessors, with much diligence, he was able to bring Ganga to this world and purify it. So in the same way, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, that flow of the Ganga, the purifying Ganga of pure devotional service, that had become stopped, just like we find in the Puranas that Bhagirat, with all his austerities, was able to bring the Ganga to the earth, and Lord Shiva agreed to catch that on his head, otherwise the whole earth would just be washed away by the flow of the Ganga. But he caught it, and it got caught up in his jota, in his top knot. So it's like that. The flow of pure devotion had become stultified. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur, just like Bhagirat, by performing austerities, he pleased Lord Shiva. Then again he brought the Ganga out. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur revived that movement. And then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur expanded the work of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And Srila Prabhupada, the representative of all the Acharyas, brought that to the Western countries in pursuance of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Manobhishta. Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Jena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamaham Dadati Swapadatikam. The heart's desire of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Priti Vite Ache Jota Nagaradigram Savatra Pacha Hebe Morana. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's desire was that Krishna consciousness be preached in every town and village of the world, and Srila Prabhupada made that possible. Somehow or other, it's inconceivable. You can say in some way it must be the will of Providence. After the passing of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, there was tremendous turbulence within the spiritual institution he founded, and the mission which he had just inaugurated shortly before, he just sent devotees to the West shortly before his leaving this world, that it actually continued for some time. One of his disciples remained in the West for some time after Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur passed away, but then for one reason or another, there was no more support, financial support coming from India, and the clouds of war were gathering in Europe, and the war within the Gauriya Math had already started before the Second World War. So the mission of spreading Krishna consciousness to the Western countries became almost forgotten. And preaching of Krishna consciousness, preaching of eventually the infighting within the Gauriya Math settled down to some extent, and various devotees, those who wanted to preach, many of them came out and they started their own institutions, and the preaching continued. But the endeavor to preach in the Western country, that was more or less abandoned. No one was even really thinking about it. It's a pretty difficult struggle to preach, even in India. There's one anecdote told by Dolagovinda Shastri, Dr. Dolagovinda Shastri, who's alive even today in Cuttack, in Orissa. Now you may know when Srila Prabhupada had a house in Sitakanta Banerjee Lane in Calcutta, and he let out part of that house to his dear godbrother Srila Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Maharaj. Prabhupada wanted that he would preach, that Sridhar Maharaj would preach, but Sridhar Maharaj was somewhat reticent to do so. But Sridhar Maharaj had a mud next to Prabhupada's house. So Prabhupada was, at that time he was Abhay Charan Aravinda Das, Adhikari. He was coming and going. He wasn't so much time in Calcutta. He was coming and going for business, he was going outside. So when he would come to Calcutta, he would join in the programs and associate with the devotees, and his godbrother and godbrother's disciples. So one of those disciples there was Dolagovinda Shastri. He wasn't actually initiated by Sridhar Maharaj, he was initiated by another disciple of Srila Bhakti Saraswati Thakur. So he was there, Dolagovinda Shastri, and he was teaching Sanskrit, and they'd have many discussions. And one day they were discussing among themselves this Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's prediction. Prithivite ache jata nagaradi gram sabacha prasha hoibe morna. Prithivi prajanto jata ache deshagram. Something, actually in original Chaitanya Bhagavad was a little bit different. So they were discussing that. They're saying, well, how is that possible? How is it possible? How can that be? That this will come true. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had also given his prediction that in a short time the people of the Western world, the Russians, the Prussians, the French, the Americans, the British, they will raise banners in their streets and chant throughout the streets the names of Lord Chaitanya, and they will join with the people of our country and they will embrace each other. He said, when will that day come? He said, very soon it will come. Bhaktivinoda Thakur predicted. The devotees were at Sitakanta Banerjee Lane, they were discussing, how can that be possible? Who could do that? They could understand it wasn't going to happen just by chance. Who will do that? So Prabhupada, this Abhay Charan Day, this household of devotees, didn't have much time like the devotees in the Math, the brahmacharis, didn't have so much time for reading and chanting. He was busy running around making money, and he would sometimes come to their programs. And often he would give lectures. He'd arrange programs for Sridhar Maharaj, and then Sridhar Maharaj would come and he would give the lecture himself. So he was an active householder, but busy with family affairs. So they were discussing all this, and he was there, and they said, who can do that? And Prabhupada said, some fool will do it, not any of you. This was recounted by Dola Govinda Shastri, when one day in Cuttack, he went back to his home in Cuttack, after being a brahmachari for many years. He went back to his hometown, and married, and like that, still there, very old now. So one day, must have been about 1976, he was walking in the street in Cuttack, and he saw a big, tall American with a shaved head and saffron clothes on, and Gauriya Vaishnava Tilak. So he was astonished. What is this? You don't see that many people with Gauriya Vaishnava Tilak. He's very happy to see anyone, but you don't see many. Probably it's the first American he'd seen ever. Or maybe in Calcutta. In those days he'd seen, even in those days. But certainly not in Cuttack. It was pretty unusual. After the British left, to see Westerners. So he approached him and said, what is all this? What's going on here? And Bhagavat Prabhu, he explained, he opened one magazine, Back to Godhead, and he said, this is our Guru, he came to the Western countries. And he taught us all these things. So immediately, Dola Govinda Shastri recognized. He saw Abhay Charna Arindaba. Abhay Babu! Oh! He recognized. Then he remembered, some fool will do it. Not any of you. He told this story. Very sweet, huh? All glories to Srila Prabhupada, who very kindly came and saved us. Jai Srila Prabhupada. Any questions, comments? Krishna Vidhi is commenting on this every day by going out in the streets of London and pleasing Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and all the acharyas by chanting the holy names of Krishna in the streets of London. Yeah.
Maharaj, it's mentioned, Prabhupada said to the other devotees in the Gaudiya Math, one fool will do, but not any of you. So what's the reason behind what Prabhupada says?
You say. Hare Krishna. I have to go now. Program in East London, the other side of the traffic jam. Takes maybe 20 minutes to drive. In the middle of the night, and about 1 hour at this time. So we should go now. Yeah.
There is some sign written by Srila Prabhupada to say, Namaste, Namaste, some Prabhupada, some for Prabhupada. Can you tell me something about that?
No, I don't know what it is, so I can't. So, Hare Krishna. Well, let us all glorify Prabhupada. I'm trying to do so through books. Here's a book I wrote. Jai Srila Prabhupada. Glorification of His Divine Grace, Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada told me